Hello and welcome back to another video feature of the Immersive Worlds Handbook. Today it's with great excitement I present to you my feature, What is the City? Here at Universal CityWalk in Universal City, California. This feature will focus on what Universal CityWalk is, its controversies, and its many innovative and important design contexts, as well as some of my ethnographic observations during my visit to CityWalk somewhere near 2 years ago. And today, as we think about Universal CityWalk, I would offer to you the following general critiques that people have offered about this space. The first is the idea of a lack of authenticity. Connected to this is the idea that the space is too overly simulated, representative of the simulacrum that Jean Baudrillard talks about in his takes on consumer society, Las Vegas, and so forth. The next would be it's an exclusive space. It's one, perhaps because of consumerism and social class connections, does not really offer that sense of the Jane Jacobs organicism that I think is still popular today as a theme in critiquing spaces like these, including, I would say, the Las Vegas Strip. And then the last of these is the idea of consumer orientation. The notion here is that the only thing that people have to offer or to engage in really is to be a consumer. And so these tend to be the general critiques that we often find in spaces like Universal CityWalk. Now, when we imagine some of these critiques, I think we could often say that if we juxtapose two images here, on the left, a bazaar, what appears to be an authentic street market, on the right, a space of simulation, of neon signs, of storefronts, and so forth. And so one of the tasks for us today, I think, is to talk about what exactly constitutes a city space, what makes it authentic, what makes it inauthentic. And for many people, I would say any sort of consumer orientation, just stepping into a shopping mall like this, because of the brands, because of the storefronts, because of the orientation of space and guests to it, it is by its very nature a space that we should be critical of. Now, looking back at images here, video I shot of Universal CityWalk, we see certainly a similar orientation in terms of how the guest is introduced to the space. One of the things you note quite quickly at CityWalk is the facades, the signage, the lights. I'll show you some of these later. And so I think for many people, the concern is that the orientation of the space is too consumerist in nature. We can imagine people walking into any storefront, say in CityWalk, and having a moment like this. There's a sense of commodity fetishism, as Marx talked about. There's a sense that there's something beckoning you from behind the storefront windows as you walk into the space, this desire to have a commodity. And this is, of course, Marx's critique. I think any contemporary Marxist might look at the behavior of consumers like this, stereotypical desire for objects, even taking photos of those objects to share on social media. I think Marx would say that, or rather a contemporary Marxist would say, that a space like Universal CityWalk is certainly one that exemplifies the highlighting of the brand, the taking of the brand to almost levels of personification, the focus on overt consumerism, the idea that we should be mediated, riffing off a little bit of the Situationists, Guy Debord, the Society of the Spectacle, the idea that we are often connected socially through images, through brands, through consumer objects, again, that we desire. And certainly shopping malls, for as long as we've had the famous arcades of Europe, have long been a site or sites in which people do have social experiences. But I think one of the questions for us today is to ask, what can be had of these spaces in terms of any authentic experiences? And as I'll get into later with some of the critiques offered of Universal CityWalk, this is a space that has been highlighted as one of the greatest culprits, if you will, in terms of taking consumerism to this level of what some would say is almost an absurd level in terms of the highlighting of the brand. What I've done here is I've taken some of my video footage, and I've attached a filter here just highlighting some of the storefronts. And this could almost be a metaphor, I believe, for some people. For some critics who've looked at the space, whether they've actually visited it or not, the feeling is that it's too garish, it's too over the top. What's being highlighted are these signs, these storefronts, these windows, these consumer objects, the distinctive brand characteristics. I think it's a great example, frankly, of how the brand has been taken to this status, this stage, almost becoming its own religious object, if you will. These, the churches or temples of the future, in which brands have become so important in our lives. Now, as we'll get into later, for the Giardia Group and others who design spaces like this, they would say that's exactly one of the points, to create these incredibly iconic moments for the guest, such that they'll remember, they'll feel comfortable, they'll also feel good about entering some of the storefronts and looking at some of the goods that are available. And we can actually do that here in my video, walking into the Dodgers store, taking a look a little bit, and as you'll see in some cases, there's a paralleling inside in terms of the brand, in terms of the spatial design, what you see on the exterior here at Universal CityWalk. Okay, as we leave the Dodgers store, we can look a little more closely at the Giardia Group and some of the approaches they've taken here to CityWalk. The first slide here shows you it's from their website, and it talks about what they intended in terms of creating this iconic place. And one of the things I was going to say is you could look at this, their YouTube page. You can also go to their website and just browse around their projects. It's a fascinating exercise to go to great design firms, to their websites, and to really read their, if you will, manifestos and their approaches to space. And I think it's one of the more enjoyable things you can do, in my opinion, to learn about some of these immersive spaces. And so one of the things I did was I looked at one of their other projects and tried to get a sense of their foundational approaches. And these are key, I think, to understanding any of the Giardia Group's spaces. How do you feel is certainly a significant thing to think about when you know you've found the right place in your city. So the sense of belonging and authenticity that people crave so often, and the idea that experience makes the place. And I think you always see that in the spaces that they design, regardless of what the critics say. You can see here on a very sunny day here, this is one of my stock videos, all the people moving through. If you've seen my other video on Beursplein in Rotterdam, another great example of a space that really has a focus on pedestrian flow and curiosity. We're looking at here some of my images from, these are, I believe from the 90s, right? A lot of the stores have changed. I wanted to give you a bit of a perspective about what's changed over the years. Seeing a little more here of the spaces from current day and age. So this was in, I want to say 2015 when I last visited, and it shows you some of the remarkable spaces here, the different brands, the different storefronts. The eye is never bored, I think, when you're at CityWalk. Certainly some people would say you're overstimulated, but that's a critique you could take. But for the type of space that it is, I think it is about maybe not overstimulating, but certainly stimulating the guest in as many ways as possible. So I should say there's a very specific connection I have to CityWalk and many of the other spaces of the Giardia Group, and that's in the Immersive Worlds Handbook. I had the great pleasure to interview one of their lead architects, David Rogers, and it was an exciting focus here on placemaking. So I just wanted to share a little bit of that with you, because I think it does give you a sense about what they envision in their spaces. And I have to say, for the critics, they've probably never read any of these interviews. They've never thought about placemaking in this sense, because they have these very over-the-top, generalized, stereotypical arguments. You'll see this later with Huxtable and Goldberger. The idea is that you can exchange one space for the other. They're all the same. Everyone in the space is inauthentic, robotic, and consumers-oriented, focus on solipsistic exercises, hedonistic behaviors, and so forth. Now again, maybe we're crazy, maybe these architects are crazy, but if you read David Rogers and his perspective on placemaking it's a very deep enterprise. It is about the pleasure of the guest. It is about creating opportunities. Now, is this all happening within a consumer space? Of course it is. But that doesn't distract us from the fact that people are experiencing things in these spaces that are very meaningful to them, and they also allow opportunities for brands and for particular services and goods to have a footing with guests and perhaps to create their own opportunities for authenticity and real sorts of connections with many of the guests and customers that they enjoy. And I thought it'd be good to reflect just a bit here on what types of experiences the Jardy Group creates for guests in terms of thinking about their approaches to placemaking. So looking very specifically at CityWalk, I would say that the space is iconic, again, in terms of its branding, its signage. It's very memorable. It creates a sense of belonging for guests. That relates to also a social experience where guests want to be around others in that same space. And then lastly, very importantly, there are opportunities for story and narrative. And please, in this sense, don't think of maybe some of the story and narratives, say, at the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, where there's a more literal story or a story that has plots and characters you could follow. When I talk about story and narrative in CityWalk, obviously I'm talking about other things, more magical, abstract experiences, things that operate on levels of symbolism that are denoted more by abstraction than their specificity. So these are four characteristics I feel really do come into focus here at CityWalk, and I think establish, in my understandings of the Jardy Group, some of the things they're trying to develop in all of their memorable experiential spaces around the world. So I was thinking recently that I've never done a video feature focused just on storefronts and signage, and so I can do a mini one here for you perhaps, because I think it's one of the interesting ways in the use of signage and storefronts that CityWalk establishes its iconic sense of connection with the guests. Now, jump back in time here a little bit. Do you remember the Gap logo controversy? Gap had a very iconic logo design since 1969. Then 2010 they changed it, and it was you see the new version here, and then they went back after that, shortly after that, to the old one. But there was much outrage because people really felt, I think, a sense of connection to their identity being connected to the logo. And so it's not surprising to us when we look at some of these amazing storefronts and these very vigorous and almost performative signs that there really is something to be said about the entrance experience. Now, critics have said that some of this is maybe too over the top. I think I understand that, but when you tour the many storefronts here, as I did at CityWalk, you see that they all fit together. If they're garish, they're all garish. So there's a sense of consistency. The neon approach, the over-the-top performativity of the typefaces, the uses of color, the lighting, as we'll see later with some of the shots at night and so forth. So I think it works quite well. But again, for the critic, the assumption is that this is inauthentic, right? Because it's too much. It's going too far, perhaps. You get the giant size Cinnabons, and there are other versions of this. You see this in many other malls, and I think it's being replicated around the world, really, where there's a idea that you can use, like the Johnny Rockets here, this really over-the-top giant hamburger and fries as part of your branding, right? It's so iconic for the guest. And here at Buca di Beppo, which is also a very, like Bubba Gump's, a very over-the-top restaurant that certainly fits in with the signage here at Universal CityWalk. Now, earlier I spoke of some of the general critiques of CityWalk. I wanted to offer you a few more, but more specific criticisms. This is from the New York Times 1993 Architecture Review, Who Should Define a City? And let me just read you these quotations because I think they're interesting. He says here, CityWalk is not in a class with the first-rate buildings the Los Angeles architects have produced in recent years. It's in a class with the Psycho House. Though created by the Jardy Partnership, a Los Angeles architectural firm, CityWalk's zippy collage of signs and storefronts is more likely to be nominated for an Oscar than for a Pritzker, the famous architecture prize. No one would mistake the mall's overscaled facades for a row of storefronts. Even so, the place is less an escape from Los Angeles than the further mutation of its hyperactive urban genes. Really well written, those words, for sure. So the critique here, like many of the critiques, is saying that there's something going on here that is not authentic. There's not an effort to build a city in a way that maybe would connect with people. Again, the challenge of these critiques, I think, is it's quite subjective. It's very political. So what usually happens is, we'll get to in an article in a second related to this, what usually happens is the critic takes this position of superiority. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have critique, but in order to have critique, I think you have to also have the critic engaged in the real world in which people participate. Some people, by chance, might actually enjoy CityWalk, and this is something I think lost on many of the architectural critics, the cultural critics who talk about CityWalk and its challenges and so forth. So we have to engage ourselves ethnographically in the spaces we're studying, I believe, prior to trying to critique or analyze or interpret what the space is offering. Now, perhaps the most legendary of critics of not just spaces like CityWalk, but of theme parks, is Paul Goldberger. Goldberger, over the years, along with Ada Louise Huxtable, has been one of the most vocal critics of these types of spaces. So I wanted to share with you this brief excerpt from this lecture he gave in 2001 at UC Berkeley. And he says, "Surely by now most of you have seen CityWalk, that pseudo-city in Los Angeles produced by Universal, which raises the curious question, is it a city street masquerading as a theme park, or a theme park masquerading as a city street? We're not quite sure, and this is precisely how the designers of this place want it. CityWalk is a perfect metaphor for the city at this moment." Now, if you know about Goldberger's work, he certainly takes a lot from Jane Jacobs and her notions of the organicism of the city. There are many others, contemporary thinkers, Thomas Bender, who had a chance to hear talk years ago from NYU, who takes a lot of Jacobs' notions and brings them forward. And I think in general we see that if there's a consumerist orientation, I've talked about this earlier, a focus on simulation, an emphasis on entertainment that involves some form of spectacle, outward sociality or gregarity, then these critics jump on it. These critics are quite upset, frankly, right? And this idea that it's a metaphor for the city suggests that there's a traditionalist city that we need to preserve, and it's something I think that is unproblematized by many of these critics. Again, it's a perfect straw man, whether the theme park or consumer spaces like CityWalk, for individuals like Goldberger, totally unexamined notions and critiques. And actually it brings up another chapter in the recent Reader and Themed Immersive Spaces. I was inspired to think about Huxtable and Goldberger and their critiques, and why exactly they find these types of sites to be such almost demonic spaces of their ire. So I wrote this article, Judgments Past, the Place of the Theme Space in the Contemporary World of Remaking. And I was particularly interested in the judgment that is passed by some of these critics, and exactly what's entailed in it. So I began with two quotations here, one from Ada Louise Huxtable. "The replacement of reality with selective fantasy is a phenomenon of that most successful and staggeringly profitable American phenomenon, the reinvention of the environment as themed entertainment." And then Goldberger says, "The one thing I can say is that simplistic attempts to imitate the traditional architecture of places rarely work and end up looking and feeling more like theme parks." So there's two things there, right? There's a notion that there is traditional architecture, and if you imitate it, kind of goes to Benjamin's point about the aura and the work of art under the age of its technological reproducibility. In Goldberger's mind, there's an aura here, something that is lost in these sorts of spaces. And then the second thing he's pointing to is the idea that, again, the theme park is the absolute metaphor for what's wrong with consumer society, and more particular, what's wrong with consumer architecture or the consumer city. And what I'm trying to suggest in this article is that we need to more deeply engage with the spaces. We also need to consider the criticisms. I'm not saying we shouldn't read what Huxtable or Goldberger are saying, but we shouldn't replicate it, as is often the case. I was on a panel years ago, and a student who was in graduate school was making a point, studying some of these spaces, and in a sense almost mimicking what Goldberger and Huxtable have said for all these years. So that argument has sustained itself, unfortunately, because people do not have the opportunity then to engage in new forms of criticism, to think about more middle-voiced forms of critique, to think about reflexive critique, to think about ethnographic complicity, as George Marcus has talked about extensively. All that is not even possible because for many of these folks, when they present these diatribes about these spaces, whether theme parks or consumer spaces like CityWalk, they presumably haven't visited the spaces, and if they have, they're still reliant on these old-timey, tired, in some cases I can't even call them critical. When I hear Goldberger or Huxtable talking about, in such general terms about these spaces, it's almost a laughable criticism. It almost cannot even hold any sort of water because it just has no merit, right? I mean, it's really based on a traditionalist notion of what space and city life and these sorts of spaces should look like. So I hope in the future that people will use CityWalk as an inspiration. If it offends you initially, if it upsets you, then use that as an opportunity to engage for the first time or re-engage with the space and look at it in a new way. Actually talk to people ethnographically on the ground, read the criticism. If you can, here's an idea, talk to the designers. Maybe these designers actually have done some research, and maybe they're not just sort of these mad scientists who are dreaming up crazy spaces that have no connection to guests or no connection to any of their interests or concerns. So I just have to say that it's offensive that so many of these critics have been unable to really engage these spaces, and as well they're unable to engage us as readers because what they're offering us is so simplistic and so unexamined. So it's a bit of my diatribe there, a bit of my rant, but it's what I have to say here today looking at my images of CityWalk in Southern California. Okay, so as we're touring through Universal CityWalk, I wanted to share with you another context here, and this involves two researchers I was with on the day of my visit, and we went to Bubba Gump's, and the two researchers are Filippo Carla and Florian Freitag, who are collaborators that I've worked with in so many contexts looking at theme parks. But I want to focus then on this research dialogue we had in the recent edited collection, The Reader in Themed and Immersive Spaces. We're also joined by Gordon Grice, who's an architect with Foric Inc., based in Toronto. This particular interaction, though, doesn't include Gordon. So this was on our visit to Universal Studios Hollywood and also CityWalk, and then we had a chance to have dinner at Bubba Gump's. And I think that offering this short dialogue from the reader puts in the context some of the issues I'm talking about today, particularly the notions of performance and authenticity. So let me then read you the three parts here from this short article. The first is my comments or my questions to Florian and Filippo. I wanted to mention a brief encounter that the three of us had in the hours following our research trip to Universal Studios Hollywood. You will recall that we chose to eat at the themed restaurant Bubba Gump Shrimp Company, and one of the more interesting moments came when we began to interact with our server, who seemed to be overly performative in the playing out of his role as a server at the restaurant. During our conversation, I mentioned a famous anecdote of Sartre's about a server in a French restaurant and the idea that the server was displaying inauthenticity in terms of his own approach to service. I recall that both of you found the server's approach to playing out the restaurant's theme to be too over the top. In the interest of commenting on what authenticity might look like for the future of themed and immersive spaces, perhaps both of you could comment on this exchange and some of the implications of it. And here is Filippo Carla's comments to my question. In immersive spaces, Authenticity is surely not an absolute quality of the objects, but it is a subjective quality determined by the feelings of the visitors. So the point is what most visitors perceive as authentic. In that occasion, the performance was, in our perception, inauthentic because it pushed too far. If you reconstruct, I don't know, a medieval castle and make it a completely shining and white structure, people won't like it because they expect medieval castles to be dark, dusty, and a bit dirty. This applies also to discussions on excessive renovations of real historical monuments, which have been too polished. So authenticity is about expectation and fulfillment of expectations. Too little and too much are wrong in the same way. And here then is Florian's response. Exactly. The problem with the server was that I wasn't expecting him to act the way he did, which is why I thought his performance was inauthentic. But then I was ill-prepared for the experience in the first place. I have never watched Forrest Gump. I did not get any of the references. In fact, I had not even realized the place was themed, except for a vague seaside theme, perhaps. Again, this is about recognizability and relatability. To me, Bubba Gump Shrimp Company failed in both respects. The key to successful theming is not only to know your theme, but to know your audience. And I have to say that the research dialogue, this particular questioning, developed out of our very long, over 2-hour conversation between the three of us as we had dinner here at Bubba Gump's Shrimp Company. And, it's an opportunity, I think, to really immerse yourself as you look at some of the images that I took. It's an opportunity to immerse yourself in the space and also to do a bit of ethnographic research as you think about what's happening, as you think about your own experiences, almost from a sociological, symbolic, interactionist perspective. Exactly what meanings, as we look at iconic signage related to the film, of course, as we think about what meanings are being told or made for us in a restaurant like this that has a Forrest Gump theme. So certainly a lot to think about here at Universal CityWalk. And we'll leave Bubba Gumps today in this dialogue with Florian and Filippo with a reflection that authenticity certainly is an important question to ask in spaces like these. Look at some more video here that I shot. It was starting to get dark. I believe this was after our meal at Bubba Gumps. Again, you see the truly iconic architecture, the signage, of the sort you see nowhere else, really. It is very garish. It is very over the top, as so many critics have offered of this space. As you saw earlier, over the years, certainly a lot of change has come to the storefronts and the signage. This is one thing you note at a space like CityWalk, which reminds me in so many ways of the Vegas Strip, is this sense of imminent performativity. Sites like this, seeing these air skydiving opportunities for guests and so forth. And so I would offer the idea to you today that one of the ways in which CityWalk is successful is through iconic spectacles like this one, this indoor skydiving. And I think, there's much affinity between what we see at Fremont Street in Las Vegas, which is also designed by the Giardia Group, and what we see to some extent at their production at CityWalk. And one of the things that's really key in their architectural and design plans, if you will, their philosophies, is this notion that the space should serve a social means or have a social means to connect guests and people to one another. Reminds me a little bit going back to some of the early notions at Steeplechase Park with George Chiliu trying to get at Coney Island, trying to get people involved with one another through gregarity, through various means of amusement and so forth. And I have to say there's I think a true sense of puritanicalism when you look at some of the criticisms, because no one could deny that CityWalk and Fremont Street have this true sense of social interaction that occurs in part, perhaps in primary part, because of the architecture, because of the signage, the design, the excitement there. But I think the difference is that critics would say it's not a legitimate form of pleasure. People dancing, people drinking, people engaging in what might be considered more hedonistic activities. And I think we often forget that there is this puritanical tendency that runs through a lot of the criticism, and certainly of the criticism that I've read, as I've talked about today, here at CityWalk in Universal City, California. So something for us to think about as we continue to investigate spaces such as these here at CityWalk. Okay, and as we're nearing the close of the tour today, again, I wanted you to get a sense of Universal City Walk, and you may be familiar with this space, but I wanted to show you some of my video, including this somewhat shaky video. I do apologize for that. I really do need to get on top of my stabilization, but you get a sense of what the space is like, its excitement, the hustle and bustle, the signage, the exciting storefronts. You've also had, I think, an opportunity today to think about some of the criticism. I've been pretty harsh in my critique of the critics themselves, because I just feel that we lose an opportunity to truly understand the ethnographic side of these spaces if we don't actually see what's happening on the ground. The cultural anthropologist in me is screaming out here, of course. And then secondly, as I've said, if you check out David Rogers or any of the other amazing folks at the Jerde Group, they A, know what they're doing, and B, they've thought about many of these issues, and I think you'd be quite surprised to realize that. You often don't hear this in the critical discourse that is offered about these spaces. So food for thought today I would offer you today as we look at a few more images. Now this next shot, what I was trying to do here, is from the parking lot. I wanted to just dramatically show you, starting here, just walking into CityWalk and what you experience. Again, that sense of an immersive space, and this is why I wanted to talk to the folks, David Rogers at the Jerde Group, because when you talk about immersive spaces, they've created some of the most amazing ones in the world, and CityWalk is iconic in so many ways for me. Its form has been copied around the world. It's been copied by other competitors, and certainly could say it's something that is successful because of its approach to space, because of its approach to gregarity and to connecting people and to giving them opportunities of enjoyment and so forth. So as I look at CityWalk today, and as you have the opportunity to look at some of this video, I hope you will reflect on what we've discussed and think about spaces like these in more critical senses. Certainly visit them for yourselves. Talk to the designers, talk to the people on the ground, and see what these spaces have to offer. I mean, who knows? Maybe this is the future of immersive spaces in the world. Something to think about. So please come back for additional video features of the Immersive Worlds Handbook